The greatest highways of the Viking Age were rivers. They weren't roads, they were rivers, and for centuries, these wooden longships moved along them. They moved along these flowing pathways, and they connected kingdoms, kingdoms that had never touched before. By the end, you'll see how these water roads, these forgotten water roads, rewired the continent. They rewired Europe permanently, and they laid down foundations, the economic foundations, the cultural foundations, for the world we have now. So how did that happen? How did these boats, these shallow boats made for raids, how did they become engines? Engines for a whole continental trade network. And what was exchanged? What silent exchange of ideas, of goods, happened along these rivers? That exchange forged new things. It forged new nations, new identities. We're going to trace that map. The map of a hidden revolution, a revolution that turned Scandinavia. It turned it from a distant fringe into the center of a vast web. And what does it mean? For a society to be built not on land, but on movement, on the constant movement of water, the key was a shape, the shape of a hull. To see how Viking rivers connected kingdoms, you have to look at the machine that made it possible. You know the image, a longship on a North Sea wave, the dragon head against the sky, but that's only half of it. The real genius was underneath. The hull was shallow. Maybe 18 inches of water when it was light. It could glide over depths a canoe would find difficult, so Europe's smallest tributaries weren't obstacles. They became open doors. That shallow draft was the first part of a design for total mobility. The longship was a hybrid, master of the deep sea and the inland creek. It could cross the North Atlantic under a single sail. Then, at a foreign coast, the crew could lower the mast. Now on oars, the same ship could turn inland. Nosing upriver like a serpent, penetrating hundreds of miles into a continent, that dual capability set the Vikings apart. They had a vessel that could go from the fjords of Norway to the heart of Russia, or from Denmark to the gates of Paris without changing ships. The geography of Europe didn't change. Their tool just refused to see the barriers. The construction made it possible. Shipwrights used a clinker-built method, overlapping planks fastened with iron rivets that made a hull that was strong and flexible. It could twist with river currents or the squeeze of winter ice. Instead of shattering, the keel was often just a thickened plank that let it skim over sandbars and gravel beds, where a deeper keel would have grounded for good. Every element served access. Even the steering oar on the starboard side was for quick, precise maneuvers in tight river channels. But seeing these ships only as weapons of war misses their greater function. For every voyage that ended in a raid, countless others were journeys of connection. The same hull that carried warriors could hold bundles of Nordic furs. Blocks of amber like captured sunlight, ingots of silver from distant mines. It could carry human cargo too, lives traded along these routes, a reminder of the era's complex economy. The longship was a transporter. It was the semi-truck of the Viking Age, moving commodities from where they were abundant to where they were desired. Creating value through movement, this single invention turned the map of Europe inside out. Where kingdoms saw impenetrable forests and marshlands, Viking traders saw a network of watery highways. A river wasn't a border, it was an invitation. The shallow draft longship was the master key. It unlocked a continent's back doors and started to rewire the relationships between distant peoples. People who never had a direct line to one another before. The story of this network isn't just about what was moved. It's about who was doing the moving. A key is no good without a door, and for the Vikings the most valuable doors were in the east. That was the second piece, a route so difficult it pushed human endurance. It started with a choice on the Baltic coast, west toward familiar shores, or east into pine forests and rivers they didn't know. If you went east, you faced a logistical problem. You could sail into the Gulf of Finland, but the real journey began where the water ended, where the land rose between river systems. That's where you had to portage. You'd unload the ship partway, use logs as rollers, and then the men would pull, dragging tons of wood and cargo over forest trails for miles, just to reach the next river. It was a brutal price to pay for access. The reward was the river network of what's now Russia and Ukraine. Two rivers became famous, the Dnieper flowing south. They called it the road to Byzantium, a highway to Constantinople, a city of unimaginable splendor, but the Dnieper had these rapids, a notorious stretch of churning water and stone. You needed local guides, you needed skill. Every rapid had a name, some descriptive, some ominous. It was a calculated risk, safety traded for the riches of the south. Then there was the Volga. That river bent southeast into the Caspian Sea, and that sea was a gateway to the Abbasid Caliphate, to the markets of Baghdad. To the northern Silk Road, a Viking trader on the Volga was connected to a global economy. He could trade northern furs for silver from Samarkand, for silks from China, for spices from India. This wasn't random. It was a highly organized commercial operation. To secure it, they built fortified way stations, places like Staraya Ladoga. Novgorod started as simple trading posts, stockades on a riverbank for storing goods, repairing ships, but these dots on the map grew. They attracted local Slavs. Craftsmen, farmers, they became towns, multicultural towns, then powerful city-states. The river carried goods, it also carried people, and it carried power. From that fusion came a new political entity, the Kievan Rus, a state born from river trade, a blend of Norse organization and Slavic tradition, ruled by princes who traced their line back to Viking adventurers. The economic change was deep. In Scandinavia, you find hoards of Islamic silver dirhams, coins pierced and worn from travel. That silver became the lifeblood of the north. A new standard of wealth. It fueled local economies, it funded projects back home, and in Constantinople, the elites wore cloaks trimmed with Arctic fox fur. A status symbol delivered by that same river network. The eastern route was more than a path, it was a pump. It systematically moved the wealth of empires into Scandinavia. And in doing that, it changed the balance of power in Europe. The rivers in the east weren't the only way to gain power. Some groups went toward Byzantium, but others went west. The rivers there were different. They weren't long trade routes. They were deep channels going right into wealthy kingdoms, the Seine, the Loire, the Rhine. These were the main arteries of the Carolingian Empire and the Anglo-Saxon lands. For Viking leaders, they weren't barriers. They were like maps pointing straight to the treasure. The plan was simple. A fleet would show up at a river's mouth, a sudden forest of masts. Then, using those same shallow boats, they'd row inland, past villages that could only watch. Past defenses built for attacks from land, not from the water. The rivers went around every traditional wall. In 845, a large force did this on the Seine. They sailed up past Rouen and they besieged Paris. They took the city. They only left after a huge payment of silver. That event sent a shockwave. It proved no inland city was safe from a fleet that used rivers like roads. But then the story changed. The rivers that brought raids started to bring something else: settlement. The raids created footholds, and those footholds needed bases. Look at the River Ouse in northern England. Viking armies took the old Roman town of Eboracum. They called it Jorvik. It grew into a major city, a trade hub. Craftsmen worked amber and jet. Merchants traded goods from the Middle East. The river brought the settlers in, and then it became the town's connection to the world. The biggest change, though, was on the Seine. Decades of pressure led to a deal. In the early 900s, the Frankish king gave a huge piece of land at the river's mouth to a Viking leader named Rollo. That land became Normandy. In return, Rollo and his men would defend the coast from other Viking fleets. It was a full integration. These Norse settlers, the Northmen, became the Normans. They adopted the language, they converted to Christianity. They mixed their own skills with Frankish ways. Within generations, they weren't outsiders. They were one of the most powerful duchies in Europe. The river that was their highway for attack became the center of their new home. This western shift was less about moving goods and more about moving people. The river networks allowed a slow colonization. Norse settlers came by water. They claimed land along the banks for farms. They slowly mixed with the local populations. This changed everything. It changed place names. So many English towns still have Norse endings. It put hundreds of new words into English, from sky and egg to legal terms. It brought new art styles, those intricate, twisting animal patterns that blended with local designs. The genetic makeup of places like northern England and Normandy was rewritten. So the eastern rivers pumped silver north. The western rivers did a different kind of work. They turned raiders into traders, then into settlers, then into neighbors. The waterways became veins. A new cultural blood flowed through them, merging Norse and Frankish, Norse and Anglo-Saxon into something new. The legacy wasn't just in silver hoards. It was in the fabric of nations, in the words we speak, in the landscape itself. A river only flows one way. It carves one path from its source to the sea. So moving between these separate systems, that was the question. How does a trader get from the rivers of the Baltic to the rivers that go south to the Black Sea? The answer wasn't in the water. It was in the mud and the forest between them. The fourth piece of the network, the most demanding physically, was the portage. Think of the sound, wood groaning on wood, the shouts of exhausted men. A longship emptied out being pulled on a path of logs, dragged over land. That was portage. A brutal process. It turned geography from a wall into a door. They'd find the narrowest point of land between two river systems, the watershed. Then they'd haul everything. The ship itself, its sail, every bundle of furs, every chest of silver, for miles sometimes, all to launch again on a new river, flowing a completely different direction. These portage points were the secret hinges, strategic choke points. Control them, and you controlled the flow of goods across a continent, and Norse traders did control them. They fortified key crossings. One vital link was between the Lovat River, flowing north to the Baltic, and the western Dvina, which could connect to the Dnieper. Another was the series of land routes around the Dnieper's own rapids. These weren't just paths, they became enterprises. Guards were posted, tolls were collected. Help was offered for a fee. A traveler without local knowledge wouldn't get far. What began as a muddy track soon grew. Where people have to stop, commerce follows. These sites became trading posts. Craftsmen set up to repair ships damaged on the rollers. Merchants traded with local tribes. Secure storage was built. These dots on the map, born from necessity, evolved into the earliest settlements. Some grew into powerful towns. They were the original logistics hubs. The medieval equivalent of a major highway interchange. This reveals a mindset. The Vikings didn't see geography as a series of obstacles. They saw it as a puzzle. A three-dimensional puzzle of water and land. A river didn't end where the water stopped. Its pathway continued overland if you had the strength to follow it. By connecting these waterways, they created shortcuts of staggering ambition. A journey from the Baltic to Constantinople by sea meant going around all of Europe. But using the river and portage system, they cut directly across the continent's heart. They turned a months-long sea voyage into a difficult but controlled overland and river route. That logistical ingenuity is the lasting lesson. It prefigured our world of interconnected supply chains. they understood that true connection requires bridging the gaps. Seeing the whole system, not just the convenient parts, the portage was the hard link, the sweaty, real-world work that turned separate rivers into a single, continent-spanning web. And at the end of that grueling haul, with a new river flowing before them, they were no longer in the north, they were on a road to empires. You open a Viking trader's chest. You're expecting plunder, but it's commerce, Arctic fox fur bundled tight, soft, white like holding winter, lumps of raw amber, golden, warm, with ancient insects trapped inside. These weren't just goods, this was northern identity, turned into something the wider world wanted. So down the river roads it went, to places where these things were rare. Where they became precious. In Constantinople, a Byzantine noble would pay a fortune for that fur trim, a symbol of wealth, a connection to a frozen, mythical world. That demand, that's what pulled Scandinavia into the center of a continental conversation. They weren't on the edge anymore, they were the exclusive suppliers. But trade only works when both sides gain. So what came back up those rivers? The longships returned heavy, silks from Byzantine workshops, light as air, shimmering. Intricate glass beads from the Rhineland, far more sophisticated than anything local. Spices with scents unknown in the north, and silver, above all silver. Mountains of it in Islamic dirham coins, tens of thousands found in hoards across Sweden, Denmark, the Baltic. They were often cut into pieces, hacked into smaller denominations for local markets. That was the real transformation. That river-borne silver didn't just make individuals rich, it monetized entire northern economies for the first time. It became a standard, a way to measure value recognized from the Volga to the North Sea. Think of 1 silver dirham, minted in Baghdad, maybe under Caliph Harun al-Rashid. It traveled north by caravan to the Caspian. A Rus trader there exchanged sable pelts for a bag of these coins, took them up the Volga through the portages to the Baltic. In a market town like Burka, he might use some to pay for ironwork for provisions. A local chieftain takes that coin, has a jeweler melt it down, mix it into a brooch designed in a new hybrid style. Part Norse animal art, part inspiration from a foreign textile. That object gets buried with its owner, a sign of status for centuries. The coin's metal circulated, but its origin story, its connection to a global network, was woven into the culture. This exchange was never just economic. It was a silent, constant transfer of prestige and ideas. A Frankish sword hilt acquired through trade changed a local smith's sense of design. The taste for spices hinted at culinary worlds beyond the fjord. The act of using coins, participating in a money economy, shifted how society thought about value, wealth, and power. The river network was Europe's circulatory system. These goods were the lifeblood. They carried cultural DNA from one kingdom to another. They nourished political alliances, gifts of exotic items, sealing deals between kings. They fueled a curiosity that made the world feel smaller, more connected. From the docks of Baghdad to the shores of Dublin, the flow of things was quietly rewiring how people saw their place. A bag of silver dirhams is a portable fortune, but you need somewhere to spend it. The river networks created that wealth, but they also needed a place to concentrate it. So the sixth element was the node, a fixed point where all those flowing pathways came together. Not a camp, but a town, a new kind of place for Northern Europe, born directly from the logic of the trade route. You look at a map of these early centers: Hedeby, tucked into the narrow neck of the Jutland Peninsula, Burka, on an island in Lake Mälaren, guarding the way into central Sweden. Novgorod, where the Volkhov River flows out of Lake Ilmen. Their locations aren't accidents, they're calculations. They sit at the precise points where major waterways meet, or where a portage has to begin. These weren't organic villages that grew slowly over centuries. They were deliberate foundations, strategic, established by powerful figures to control the river traffic. To tax it, to profit from it, they started as toll booths and warehouses, and then they became something far greater. Walk through the gates of Hedeby at its height. The air is thick with languages: Norse, Old Saxon, Frisian, Slavic, even snippets of Greek and Arabic from travelers further east. In one stall, a merchant from the far north offers reindeer pelts from the Sami. Across the way, a craftsman from the Rhineland sells glass drinking horns. The transaction is settled not with barter, but with a handful of hacked silver. A local official checks the weight on a small, standardized scale. These are the sounds of a proto-market economy, functioning centuries before the great fairs of Champagne. Archaeology shows this organized chaos. Excavations reveal grids of wooden streets, carefully laid out plots for workshops, deep wells for fresh water. They find the remains of specialized crafts: bone and antler workers, amber carvers, metalsmiths making jewelry in hybrid styles, and the small lead weights. They come in standardized sets. That's evidence of a regulated system, where trust in measurement was essential for trade between strangers, and surrounding it all, a massive semicircular earthwork and a palisade. These towns were wealthy. They knew they needed protection. The walls weren't just against armies, they were to secure the valuable flow of goods inside. This environment was a furnace for cultural fusion. A Slavic potter might adopt a Norse design. A Norse shipwright might learn a new technique from a Frisian. A Christian cross pendant could be worn alongside a Thor's hammer amulet, both bought in the same market. These were Europe's first true cosmopolitan hubs north of the Mediterranean. Power here was often a hybrid creation. In a place like Kiev, you could have a prince with a Norse name and Norse companions, ruling a Slavic population, collecting tribute in furs to sell down the Dnieper to the Byzantine Greeks. His authority was built on his control of the river, not just on ancient lineage. The legacy of these towns is profound. They were the direct blueprints for the later Hanseatic League cities, the ones that would dominate Baltic trade in the Middle Ages. More than that, they established the very idea of the commercial town in Northern Europe. A place defined by exchange, by craft, by a population drawn from many places. They proved that prosperity could be built on connection, not just conquest. When the Viking Age slowly faded, these nodes in the network didn't disappear. They remained. They'd transformed from temporary camps into permanent seeds. Seeds that would grow into the cities we recognize today, into the connected world. Wealth draws eyes. That steady movement of silver and silk along the rivers, the empires to the south saw it. They saw these northern waterways as channels for power, not just for goods, and that changed things. Viking leaders, these pirate kings, they started a kind of dance with emperors. They were negotiating for a place inside the order. The most famous of these talks happened in the east at Constantinople. After years of trade and conflict on the Dnieper road, a Rus prince, Oleg, took a fleet to the city walls. He didn't sack it, he forced a deal. The treaties from 907 and 911. They were masterpieces, not just peace, they were detailed commercial contracts. They set the rules: how many Rus traders could come into the city and when, which gates they could use, how much food and lodging they got. They set up legal ways to settle a dispute between a Greek and a Rus merchant. They even formalized military service. That opened the door for Norse warriors to become the Varangian Guard, the personal protectors of the Byzantine emperor. These documents mark a shift. The river network produced legitimacy, not just wealth. The ruler in Kiev was no longer a foreign raider. He was a treaty partner of the Roman Empire. His people had defined rights inside the greatest city in Christendom, integration on a grand scale. It gave a blueprint. In the west, the Frankish king made a similar calculation with Rollo on the Seine. Granting him land and a title turned a persistent threat into a loyal duke defending the frontier. The river that brought the problem also delivered the solution. But the ultimate political creation was the state itself, Kievan Rus. This wasn't a Viking kingdom moved onto Slavic soil. It was something new, a Scandinavian elite, using their control of the Dnieper and Volga routes, started to organize the Slavic tribes along the banks. They provided protection for the trade caravans. They collected tribute in furs from the hinterlands. They built fortified towns at the key portages, the river junctions. Over generations, this system of control hardened into a polity, a realm defined by its rivers. The rivers were the skeleton, the trade was the muscle and the blood. Commerce was the glue, not just conquest. The prince in Kiev was powerful because he controlled the main artery to Byzantine wealth. His authority was economic. He could reward followers with trading privileges. He could fund his rule through tolls. This model was durable. It created a stable hierarchy to administer a vast territory. And from this fusion, Norse organizers, Slavic population, Byzantine religion and law came a distinct identity, the Rus identity, the origin of the name Russia. It shows something about the Viking Age. The rivers moved more than silver and amber. They moved ideas about power and governance. They turned mobile war bands into settled administrations. They turned chieftains into princes. By providing a stable, taxable flow of wealth, they made kingdoms possible where only tribes had been. The legacy is on the map. Not in the dotted lines of battlefields, but in the solid lines of trade routes that became borders. The most enduring conquests were of position, secured where two rivers meet. The river roads carried their greatest cargo unseen. It wasn't silver, it wasn't silk, it was ideas. The seventh element in the network's power was this channel for faith and culture, reshaping Europe from the inside. A longship going north up the Dnieper or the Volga might have a special passenger, not a warrior, not a merchant, a missionary, or maybe a captured Christian priest taken in a raid whose teachings began to seep into the minds of his captors over years of travel. The same currents that brought Arctic furs to Constantinople carried back the stories of a new god, a single deity, a written scripture. This was never a sudden conquest. It was slow, osmotic, made possible by the constant, trusted movement of people along these established routes, and the flow went both ways. Christian ideas traveled north, and Norse pagan beliefs traveled east along the Slavic rivers. The stories of Odin the Wanderer, of Thor's hammer, blended with local Slavic spirits and deities. You hear echoes of that in later folklore. Figures of immense strength or cunning wisdom, they carry a trace of that northern mythology, filtered through a new landscape. The exchange showed in art and architecture. In towns like Novgorod, the first stone churches built by the Rus princes didn't look like the wooden stave churches of Norway. They were inspired by the grand, domed designs of Byzantium, designs seen by traders in Constantinople and carried home in memory. And in the other direction, the distinct Norse art style, the urn style, with its elegant, interlacing animals, traveled south on crafted objects. It appeared on items from Ireland to Russia, a silent signature of the northern aesthetic moving through the network. This transmission reshaped concepts of power and law. The Christian model of kingship, where a ruler was anointed by God, it began to appeal to Scandinavian leaders looking to consolidate authority beyond just military might. It offered a framework for administration, for written law codes recognized across the Christian world. Adopting this faith wasn't just spiritual. It was a political decision, an economic one. It granted entry into the wider European community of monarchs. It made trade and alliances with kingdoms like France and England smoother. A baptized king could negotiate as a peer, not an outsider. The rivers prepared the ground for this. For generations, they had carried not just goods, but news. Stories, a sense of a world much larger than the fjords. They had already softened cultural boundaries, made foreign ideas less strange. So when a formal conversion finally came, decreed by a king like Harald Bluetooth in Denmark or Vladimir the Great in Kiev, it was the culmination. A century of quiet exposure, the water highways had done the work, making the new cosmology feel less like an invasion, more like a logical next step in a long conversation. The legacy of that silent exchange is profound. It helped forge the medieval Christian identity that would define Europe for centuries. The continent's spiritual map was redrawn by the same currents that had redrawn its economic map. The Norse world didn't disappear, it merged, its stories and symbols woven into a new tapestry, carried on those timeless rivers long after the longships were gone. The river's current carried everything, amber, silver, ideas, and it carried people. The ninth element of this network was a human one, a dark current of connectivity. It forces a more complete picture, because for all the cultural exchange, for all the economic boom, the Viking river networks also served as a pipeline. An efficient, brutal pipeline for the trade in human beings. Those same shallow boats that carried furs south, they often returned north with a different cargo. Captives taken from raids across the British Isles and from the Slavic lands to the east. The term Slav itself, over centuries, it became the root for the word slave in many European languages. A grim linguistic fossil of this commerce, major markets for this trade operated at key nodes. In the east, the town of Bolgar on the Volga was a notorious hub. Captives were sold south from there into the Islamic world. In Central Europe, Prague emerged as another significant market. This wasn't a side business. It was a primary economic engine. That immense flow of Islamic silver into Scandinavia, the very silver that monetized their economies, it was largely paid for with this human currency. Demand from the wealthy caliphates, from Byzantium, for domestic servants, for soldiers, for laborers, that demand created a pull that reshaped distant societies. The impact on the source communities was devastating. Chronicles, later records, they speak of regions left sparse, of villages emptied. It represents the brutal paradox of this age of connection. The very routes that spread art, technology, and faith, they were also instruments of profound hardship. They created winners and losers on a staggering scale. To understand the full weight of these river networks, you have to hold both truths. They were channels of illumination and channels of shadow. The same geographical ingenuity that bridged cultures also enabled this traffic. It forces us to consider the complex moral dimensions of how our world connects. A network's legacy is never simple. It's written in the silver hoards, in the fused art styles, and in the silent histories of those who traveled its routes not by choice but by force. Look at a map of northern England. The names there tell a story. Derby, Scunthorpe, Grimsby, that ending, that by, it's Old Norse for a farm or a settlement. Thorpe means a smaller hamlet. These aren't random. They're like fossils preserved in the landscape. And they cluster along certain river valleys, the Trent, the Ouse, the Humber, which are precisely the waterways Viking settlers used to move inland to claim land. The geography of their movement is written right into the modern map. It's a permanent record, a quiet one, of where they lived and farmed and put down roots. This naming was a direct result of the connectivity the rivers gave. Norse settlers arriving by boat would find a promising riverbank. They'd establish a farmstead there. And they'd call it something descriptive in their own language. Grimsby meant Grim's farm. Scafthorpe meant the hamlet by the hollow. Over generations, as they intermarried with the local Anglo-Saxon population, the Norse language itself faded from everyday speech. But those place names stuck. They became the official designation for those locations, used by everyone. The land itself kept the memory of its founders. Long after their descendants spoke a completely different tongue, the influence went beyond just suffixes. Look at the words we use in English every day. Common, sturdy words: sky, egg, window, knife, law, they, them, there. These are all loanwords from Old Norse, absorbed during centuries of contact and settlement. They weren't fancy, scholarly terms. They were the practical vocabulary of farmers and traders and neighbors sharing a life. The verb to take comes from Norse. So does to die. This was a deep, structural borrowing. It happened because the river networks created sustained, intimate contact between communities. People weren't just trading goods at a market. They were resolving disputes, discussing the weather, raising families. Language had to adapt to make that daily life possible. It created a kind of pidgin, a hybrid tongue that eventually enriched English itself. In the East, the legacy took a different form, but it was just as profound. The names of the early Rus princes Igor, Oleg, Olga, these are Slavic adaptations of Old Norse names. Ingvar, Helgi, Helga, these weren't just personal choices. They were markers of a ruling elite. Their power and identity were forged on the river roads, as these Norse-descended princes solidified their rule over Slavic populations. Their names entered the local lexicon. As symbols of authority, they became traditional Slavic names, their foreign origin blurred by time. So today, a man named Igor in Russia bears a name that traveled down the Volga 1,000 years ago. It's a subtle nod to a fused identity. Even the names of the rivers themselves sometimes bear witness. The Dnieper River's famous rapids, those treacherous passages, were given names by the Norse travelers. One was called Afer, meaning ever turbulent. Another was Gelandi, the loud one. These weren't just labels, they were vital navigational knowledge passed from pilot to pilot. They encoded experience in language, turning a dangerous stretch of water into a known entity with a Norse name, whispered by Slavic guides generations later. This linguistic legacy is the most intimate evidence of the network's success. Silver hoards can be buried, art styles can evolve, but the names of our towns, our rivers, the very words we use to craft a sentence, these are living artifacts. They prove the Viking river networks did more than move commodities. They moved people into sustained conversation. They wove strands of Norse identity into the fabric of local cultures so thoroughly it became inseparable. It shows that true, lasting connection doesn't just build trade routes. It rewires language, the fundamental code of a community, leaving an echo you can still hear. If you know where to listen, the river current carried something else too, knowledge. That was the 11th element of this network, the quiet exchange of practical know-how. Moving a ship from the Baltic to the Black Sea wasn't just endurance, it was accumulated intelligence. Every successful voyage added to a shared library of skills. Passed from pilot to pilot, from shipwright to shipwright, at riverbank markets and portage camps. Take the ship itself. The classic longship design was brilliant, but it wasn't static. In the shipyards of trading towns, Norse builders worked alongside others. They might have seen how Slavic boatmakers built for specific river conditions, using different woods or fastening methods. Frisian traders, masters of the shallow Wadden Sea, might have shared tricks for reading tidal mudflats, and in turn, Norse expertise in open water navigation using the sun, the stars, those legendary sunstones to hold a course. That would have been priceless for anyone looking to venture beyond the coast. This was a two-way street. The best ideas traveled the trade routes, improving the tools of connection for everyone, but the most critical knowledge was local. Environmental, which tributary of the Volga ran deepest in late summer? Where was the safest, sandbar-free landing on the Dnieper's eastern bank? When did the spring melt turn the Russian rivers into impassable torrents? And when did the autumn rains raise the water levels just enough for a laden ship? This wasn't written in any book. It was stored in memory, shared in stories around evening fires. A veteran trader's mental map of water levels and safe harbors was his most prized possession. A trade secret he might pass only to his son or his most trusted partner. That environmental literacy turned a dangerous wilderness into a navigable system. And the need to protect this flow of goods and people spurred other innovations. In the Slavic East, the Norse and their local partners developed a distinct fortification, the Gorodish. Strongholds on high river bluffs built with massive earthen ramparts and wooden walls. They weren't just military bases, they were secure way stations. Places to store goods, levy tolls, administer territory. Their design reflected a new need to control a linear geography, a river road, not just defend a single settlement. This was logistical architecture, and where merchants gather, rules must follow. The constant interaction between Norse, Slav, Greek, and Arab traders in places like Novgorod or Kiev created a pressing need for common understanding. How do you resolve a dispute over a damaged shipment? How is the value of a hacked silver dirham determined? Out of that practical necessity came some of the earliest written legal codes in the region, like the Ruskaya Pravda of Kievan Rus. They were essentially manuals for a commercial society, rules for property, inheritance, conflict resolution that applied to a mixed population. They provided the predictability long-distance trade needed to thrive. This circulation of how to knowledge from shipbuilding to lawmaking was the software running on the river network's hardware. It enhanced the toolkit of every society it touched. A Slavic prince learned new methods of fortification and administration. A Norse chieftain gained insights into written law and diplomacy. This shared pool of practical wisdom didn't just make the network function. It laid a groundwork. The fortified towns became the nuclei of medieval cities. The early commercial laws evolved into civic charters. The environmental knowledge of river systems informed settlement patterns for centuries. The network's true legacy was that embedded intelligence flowing as silently as the rivers, preparing the continent for what was to come. The forest was a resource, and the rivers carried it away. To build a warship or a large trading vessel, you needed straight, strong oaks. A single keel could need a tree over 100 years old. Multiply that demand across centuries for fleets that numbered in the hundreds. The scale of the harvest becomes clear. Vast tracts of Scandinavia's old-growth oak forests were steadily cleared. This wasn't just logging for local needs. It was industrial-scale extraction fueled by the river trade. The landscape was being reshaped to build the very machines that would reshape the continent. Where the ships went, the towns followed, and those settlements carved their own marks. A place like Hedeby, with its dense grid of wooden houses and workshops, needed constant fuel. For heating, for cooking, for the forges, that meant clearing the surrounding woodlands. Timber was needed for palisades, for piers, for market stalls. The establishment of these towns created rings of localized deforestation. The environment around them was managed, altered, simplified to serve human concentration. Then there were the paths. The critical portage routes between river systems began as temporary tracks. But after decades of use, after countless ships dragged over the same ground, those tracks wore down. They became permanent grooves. Dirt paths deepened into sunken lanes, visible even today from the air. These were the continent's first purpose-built overland freight corridors, etched into the earth by the weight of commerce. The demand that drove this system reached into the wild. The luxury fur trade required a constant, massive supply. Sable, marten, fox, beaver pelts were hunted intensively across the northern forests and the river valleys of Rus. This relentless pursuit had ecological consequences we can only infer. It likely pushed predator populations further into remote wilderness. It changed the dynamics of local ecosystems. The hunt for a single, perfect pelt to sell in Constantinople rippled out through the food web, altering the balance in a forest far from any market. This represents one of early medieval Europe's first large-scale, coordinated manipulations of the environment for purely economic ends. The rivers provided the means, but the goal was connection and wealth. It prompts a reflection. Our human networks, our roads and trade routes, they are never neutral. They require something from the world they pass through. The Viking Age quest to link distant kingdoms left a physical signature in cleared forests, in worn portage paths, in shifted animal populations. It's a theme that echoes down to our own canals, railways, fiber optic pipelines. Every web we weave to connect leaves a trace upon the land. The river had its own calendar. It wasn't a road you could just travel any day you wanted. The 13th element of that whole system was time, the rigid rhythm of the seasons. That's what pulsed life through everything. Connectivity wasn't constant. It was a seasonal bloom, then a long, frozen silence. It all started with the thaw. Up north, winter locked the rivers in ice. Communities waited. Then, as days got longer, a kind of collective listening began. Listening for the deep crack of ice breaking up, for the roar of meltwater filling the streams. That sound was the starting gun. It opened the gates. Ships that had been hauled ashore for months were made ready. Cargoes from the winter furs, amber, slaves were loaded. The entire economic cycle of the North synchronized with this one natural event. That created a frantic travel season. A voyage from the Baltic to the Black Sea and back was a race against the closing window of autumn. Every delay was dangerous. It enforced a brutal efficiency. Traders planned their journeys with military precision. They aimed to hit key places like the great market at Bulgar on the Volga or the fairs near Kiev at the exact moment other caravans would be there. Miss that window, and you might wait a full year to sell your goods. Nowhere was timing more critical than on the Dnieper rapids. That stretch of churning water was the great bottleneck on the road to Byzantium. To attempt it during the spring melt when the river was raging was suicide. The water would be too high, too fast, smashing ships against the rocks. But wait too long into the dry late summer and the water levels could drop, exposing more stone, making the passage equally impossible. There was a sweet spot. A period of maybe a few weeks when the river was just right. Veteran pilots knew it. They could read the water, the color of the flow, the sound of the current. Their entire year's profit and their lives depended on judging that moment correctly. This pulsed rhythm meant the network's vitality was fragile. A series of mild winters could mean several strong trading seasons in a row. Wealth would flow, towns would grow, but then a string of harsh, long winters could freeze the rivers solid for extra months, or a summer drought could make the Dnieper impassable. Trade would slow to a trickle. A trading post that thrived one decade could be abandoned the next. Not because of war, but because a shift in the climate had altered its access window. Political unrest at a key portage point could have the same effect, blocking the pulse for a season. This helps explain the archaeological record, why we see layers of incredible wealth in a town like Burka, followed by layers of simpler, poorer artifacts. It wasn't always invasion or collapse. Often, it was the simple, cyclical bust that followed a boom. The connectivity was real, but it wasn't permanent. It wasn't the assured thing we think of today. It was a tenuous thread spun anew each spring, vulnerable to the whim of the weather and the stability of distant rulers. It forces a humbling perspective. Our modern world of global supply chains operates in a climate-controlled bubble. Ships sail year-round, planes fly through storms. Digital data flows instantly. We've engineered away the seasons, but for the Vikings and for all pre-modern peoples, the environment was an active partner. Their greatest achievements in connection were acts of profound cooperation. Cooperation with natural forces they could not control. They listened to the river's schedule. And they built their world around its silent, powerful dictates. A river could only take you so far, so the 14th element was the bridge, that link between water and land. The longships could go up the rivers, but the last mile of any trip was on solid ground. That was the capillary system, a network of forest tracks, winter sled routes, roads. They fed the great river arteries and they moved the wealth inland. The Viking trade network was never just a waterway, it was an intermodal machine. Think about a single tusk taken from a walrus on the shores of Greenland. It would start a long journey, first by small boat along the coast. Then, at a certain point, it was moved to a pack animal or a sled, hauled over the treeless interior to the eastern coast. From there, another ship to Iceland, then to Norway. Once in Scandinavia, that tusk entered the river system. Down to Hedeby or Birka, a craftsman there might buy it, turn it into gaming pieces or carvings. Those finished goods could go south by river again, or be loaded onto a wagon for an overland trip to a Frankish market. That one object moved by sea, by sled, by riverboat, and by cart, each part of the journey handled by specialists for that kind of transport. This synergy maximized reach. A trade good from the Arctic could end up in a palace in Cordoba. Silk from Baghdad could end up in a chieftain's hall in Ireland. The system's efficiency was in its nodes, the points of transfer. Places like Birka weren't just ports, they were interchanges. On the docks, ships were unloaded. Cargo was sorted, weighed, taxed. Then, much of it went onto wagons or pack horses for the next stage. Trails went out from these towns, connecting to inland farms, to mining districts, to other rivers. Controlling these junctions meant immense power. A chieftain who fortified a spot where a major land route met a navigable river didn't just control the water. He controlled all movement. He could levy tolls on carts and ships. He could guarantee safe passage for a fee. He could become the indispensable middleman. This is how many early Scandinavian kingdoms solidified their authority, not just through conquest, but by dominating the points of logistical transfer. This shows a sophisticated logistical mind. They understood a network is only as strong as its connections. A river was a highway, but a cart track was the on-ramp. A winter ice road across a frozen lake was a seasonal shortcut. They used every tool the landscape offered. In winter, when rivers froze, heavy goods moved more easily on sleds across the ice, and snow turning the frozen waterways into solid roads. The calendar didn't stop trade, it just changed the method. We see a direct precursor to our own world in this. The container ships that cross oceans today don't complete the journey. They dock at massive ports where their boxes go onto trains and trucks for the final distribution. That seamless handoff from one transport mode to another is the same principle. The Vikings, in their own way, were early masters of supply chain management. They built a web, not a line, a web of routes that let a piece of amber or a silver coin or an idea travel across the entire known world. By tying river to road and sea to sled, they wove a connectivity so resilient and so far-reaching that its influence would long outlast the longships themselves. Violence was the starting capital. Those early raids on river monasteries, undefended towns, it was brutal, but it worked. You got silver, relics, people. But that model had a flaw. It was a one-time harvest. You could raid a place once, maybe twice, and then it was over. The well was dry or the locals built walls. For lasting power, you needed something else, a system, something that turned a windfall into a steady, predictable income. And the rivers, those channels of movement, gave you the mechanism. The 15th element was this shift from piracy to tribute and then to taxation. It started with a grim calculation. A Viking fleet appears on a river, a show of force. But instead of sacking the town, the leader makes an offer, pay a sum, and the fleet leaves peacefully. That was the Danegeld in the West, the Dane payment. Protection money. For the local ruler, it was a desperate bargain, spend the treasury to save the people. For the Vikings, it was a business innovation. Why destroy the source of your wealth when you could make it pay you year after year? The River Seine is the example. After the siege of Paris, the Frankish king paid thousands of pounds of silver to see the longships leave. That payment didn't end the threat, it set a precedent. It proved a river could be a conduit for tribute, not just plunder. The next step was to control the conduit itself. Instead of sailing up a river to threaten a kingdom, some groups began to seize the river. A strategic bend, a narrows, a portage site. Now you didn't have to threaten anyone. You just sat there. Every trader, every ship moving along that artery had to pass your fort. And to pass, you paid a toll. That was the transition from a protection racket to a legitimate, coercive service. The fort provided security against other raiders. The toll was the fee. It was solving a problem you yourself had created. Control of geography turned marauders into gatekeepers. This steady drip of river tolls, these fixed agreements, it created something new in the north, a reliable state revenue. Before this, a chieftain's wealth came from his lands, from gifts, from war spoils. All of it unpredictable, but a river toll, it flowed like the current. Silver came in every trading season. That changed everything. With a guaranteed income, a leader could plan. He could support a permanent corps of warriors, a standing army loyal year-round. He could fund construction, like the Trelleborg ring forts in Denmark. He could maintain a court with craftsmen and administrators. He could project power consistently, not in bursts. In the east, this process forged the Kievan Rus state. The princes in Kiev didn't just trade furs. They claimed the authority to collect polyudai, an annual circuit. The prince and his retinue would travel the river routes, stopping at Slavic settlements to collect tribute. Furs, honey, wax, this wasn't a raid. It was systematic tax collection, an assertion of sovereignty over a territory defined by waterways. The collected goods went down the Dnieper to be sold in Constantinople, turned into the silver that funded the prince's rule. The river network was the state's backbone. This shift is one of the deepest legacies. The same waterways that enabled chaotic raids became the infrastructure for orderly, extractive governance. They provided the economic model for early state formation, the ability to tax movement, to monetize geography. It turned ambitious warlords into kings. It moved power from the unpredictable sea of battle to the predictable, taxable flow of commerce. The river didn't just carry silver, it taught a lesson. That lasting power isn't taken in a chest. It's collected, coin by coin, at the bend in the river. A shard of pottery was found in the black earth of a riverbank settlement. It was far from where it was made. The color and the glaze are Byzantine, but the shape was changed by a local Slavic potter. Nearby, there's a small lead weight for a merchant's scale. And next to it, a Norse-style brooch, its pin bent from being used a long time. This is the physical evidence, the 16th layer of the network. The story is in the soil, in layers of cultural mixing that look like geological strata. Excavations at these river junctions show a world in miniature. In one level, you find Arabic silver dirhams, in another, fragments of fine glass from the Rhineland. Slavic clay spindle walls sit beside pieces of a Norse comb, carved from reindeer antler. These objects weren't placed in a museum. They were dropped or lost or just discarded in the mud of daily life. Their coexistence in one place is the proof. It shows a community where a woman might spin local wool with a Slavic tool while wearing a Norse dress fastener and paying for goods with silver from Baghdad. But some of the most powerful evidence comes from the final journeys of the connectors themselves, the ship burials. Not all Vikings got a send-off in a burning ship pushed out to sea. Many, especially the ones who lived and died along the river roads, were buried with their ships on land, buried near the waterways that defined their lives. The burial site at Salmi, on the Estonian island of Saaremaa, is one example. 2 ships were placed in a shallow trench near the coast. Inside were the remains of more than 40 warriors with their weapons and their gaming pieces. Analysis says they were Scandinavians, likely on a journey along the Baltic trade routes. their final resting place far from home, marks a point on the network. A snapshot of a mobile, armed trading expedition that never finished its voyage. Further east along the Volga, similar burials tell a richer story. A chieftain laid in his ship, surrounded by the tools of his trade. You might find a set of finely calibrated scales and weights for measuring silver, a stash of hack silver, cut-up coins from different empires, ceremonial weapons. Even the remains of riding horses and hunting dogs, showing his elite status on land as well as water. These graves are frozen moments. They capture the wealth and the far-flung connections these individuals commanded. A man buried in Sweden might have a Frankish sword, a Byzantine silk tunic trim, and a pouch of Volga silver. His identity was assembled from the entire network. Science now gives us a kind of magical precision in reading this evidence. Dendrochronology, the study of tree ring patterns, is key. When archaeologists find a ship timber or a log from a settlement wall, they can match its unique ring sequence to a master chronology. That can tell them the exact year the tree was cut down. So we don't just know a trading post was built in the 9th century. We can know it was built in the spring of 862. This lets us trace the expansion of the network like watching ink spread on a map. We can see when Norse-style fortifications appear on a Slavic river. We can date the exact season a particular ship sailed, and by extension, the journeys of the people who sailed in it. Each artifact is a silent witness. A corroded coin is a record of a transaction that spanned continents. A broken comb is a testament to personal grooming habits carried across seas. The mixed pottery in a cooking pit speaks of shared meals and cultural blending. Together, these countless data points let us map an ancient web of interaction that left no written charts. The riverbanks themselves became archives, preserving in mud and silt the story of how a continent learned to speak to itself. Every excavation is like recovering a single page from a lost ledger, slowly revealing the balance sheet of an age defined by connection. The saga was a memory palace. A vast hall built of story, not stone. That 17th layer of the river network, it's not in the soil, it's in the spoken word, the Icelandic sagas written down long after the Viking age. You hear the echo of those river journeys in them. They weren't dry chronicles, they were epic family histories, adventure tales. The geography of trade routes became the landscape of legend. A place like the realm of the Rus, the river kingdoms to the east, that wasn't just a destination on a map. In the sagas, it was Gardariki, the land of fortified towns. A place of immense wealth and immense danger. When a saga character travels to Gardariki, you know it's a journey of high stakes. It's a test. The hero will face treacherous river crossings. He'll have to outwit local chieftains or befriend them, navigate the politics of foreign courts. These stories preserved a cultural memory, a memory of what those long voyages east actually felt like. The constant negotiation, the reliance on local guides, the awe at encountering civilizations far more complex than their own. The sagas turn historical trade into a human-scale drama. A drama of ambition and survival. They also functioned as a kind of oral technology. Before GPS, before written itineraries, how did you prepare a young trader for his first journey down the Dnieper? You told him a story. A saga might describe in vivid detail the sequence of the great rapids. It would give them names, descriptive names, often ominous. The roaring one, the ever-turbulent. Just by listening, a future traveler gained a mental checklist, a checklist of the obstacles ahead. He learned the social geography, too. Which princes were known to be generous to Norse merchants, which tribes were best avoided. This embedded knowledge was crucial. It reduced the unknown. A saga wasn't just entertainment around a fire. It was a preparatory briefing, a guidebook sung in verse. Take the tale of a merchant like Otter, from the account he gave to King Alfred of Wessex. He describes sailing north, then east for days, skirting coasts of strange peoples, all to reach a great trading river. His narrative is a blend of careful observation and wonder. He notes the resources, the customs, the distances. It's a report, but it's also a story of curiosity pushing a man beyond the known world. This is the core the sagas capture. The blend of sharp economic calculation with a very human sense of awe. A trader wasn't just a businessman, he was an explorer. His success was measured in silver. But his legacy was measured in the tale he brought home. These stories also reveal something else, how the Vikings mythologized their own connectivity. Gods and heroes in the sagas undertake journeys that mirror the real river and portage routes. Odin himself is the ultimate wanderer, traveling between worlds acquiring knowledge. This divine model sanctified the life of the mobile merchant, the seeker who goes out into the unknown and returns transformed, the perilous portage. The negotiation at a foreign court, the moment of setting sail into a foggy estuary. These weren't just logistical challenges, they were stages in a heroic journey. A rite of passage. By weaving the river roads into their foundational stories, the Norse ensured the network lived on long after its economic peak had passed. The facts of trade faded, the tariffs, the cargo weights, but the feeling of the journey remained, the excitement, the fear, the wonder at a world so vast and interconnected. This is the final gift of the sagas. They remind us that behind every trade route, behind every silver hoard, there were individuals, people who felt the spray of the Dnieper rapids on their faces, who bartered by firelight in a Volga market, who dragged their ship over a forest path, dreaming of the riches ahead. The sagas give history a heartbeat. They turn the map of a network into a tapestry of countless human stories forever sailing down the river of memory. All networks have a lifespan. By the 11th century, the world of the Viking river trader was changing. Their own success started to change the landscape. Where there had been fragmented tribes, you now had powerful, centralized kingdoms. In the west, the Kingdom of France was consolidating. In the east, Kievan Rus had changed. It was a loose confederation of river towns, and now it was a Christian state. It had its own laws, it had a standing army. For a freelance Norse merchant, this new order meant less freedom. These states demanded control. They took the old river tolls and made them into heavy, consistent taxation. They enforced monopolies on certain goods. The margins for an independent operator, sailing from port to port, began to shrink. The age of the adventurer merchant was ending. The age of the regulated guildsman was beginning. At the same time, Scandinavia itself was transforming. The Christianization of the North was more than a spiritual shift. It was a profound geopolitical realignment. Kings who converted, like Olaf Tryggvason in Norway, they were now part of the community of Latin Christian monarchs. Their trade interests, their diplomatic interests, they began to pivot. They turned south and west toward fellow Christian kingdoms in England and Francia. The old eastern axis toward the Islamic world and Byzantium, it remained important, but it was no longer the sole magnetic pole for northern ambition. The cultural pull of Christendom rerouted the flow of attention, and with it the flow of commerce. Then came a new set of roads, the Crusades, starting at the end of the 11th century. They did more than mobilize armies. They reopened Mediterranean sea lanes. They secured them. These routes had been dangerous or blocked for centuries. Italian maritime republics, Venice and Genoa, they exploded in power. They created direct shipping routes from the Middle East to the heart of Europe. For a merchant in London or Cologne, it became easier to buy spices and silks arriving in Italian ports. It was often cheaper than waiting for those same goods to filter up the long river networks from the Black Sea. The world was finding new shortcuts, and some of the old river roads saw less traffic, but to say the network vanished would be a mistake, a profound mistake. It contracted, it evolved, its skeleton remained. A new era simply built different muscles upon it. The towns the Vikings founded, the towns they supercharged, they did not disappear. Novgorod, Kiev, Dublin, York, these became great medieval cities. Their street plans, their mercantile traditions, their very existence, that was a direct legacy. A legacy of that first pulse of connectivity. The trade routes they established were formalized. They were expanded by the next great commercial power, the Hanseatic League. The Hansa did not invent Baltic trade. They inherited its map. They took the Viking network of ports and waterways and turned it into a regulated corporate empire. The cog ship replaced the longship, but it sailed the same sea lanes to the same harbors. Most indelibly, the human blends became permanent. The mixing along those river valleys, Norse with Anglo-Saxon, Norse with Frankish, Norse with Slavic, that was irreversible. It created hybrid populations with hybrid traditions. These were not temporary alliances. They were the seeds of new national identities. The Normans, descendants of Vikings, would go on to conquer England. They would conquer Sicily. They reshaped European history again. The Rus identity forged on the Dnieper that would become the core of Russian civilization. The thousands of Norse words in English, the place names dotting the landscape, these were not footnotes. They were foundational layers, so the Viking river network did not end. It transitioned, it provided the infrastructure, it provided the towns, and in many ways it provided the template for the interconnected medieval world that followed. The shallow draft longship faded from use, but the channels it had carved in the earth and in the human story, they remained open. They became the arteries for a new Europe. One still learning that its strength lay not in isolation, but in the constant, challenging, rewarding flow of connection. To understand what they did, you have to look somewhere else. Over in North America, the Mississippi River system connected people for a long time. It moved copper down from the Great Lakes, shells up from the Gulf, and ideas back and forth. But that was a regional exchange, a network within a similar kind of environment. What happened on the Viking rivers was different. It connected worlds that were completely foreign to each other. The Arctic tundra, where they got walrus ivory, linked directly to the hot, dry markets around the Mediterranean. The pine forests of Scandinavia met the silk workshops of Constantinople. This was more than trade. It was bridging planetary climates, bridging whole civilizations. Then you have ancient Egypt, the famous river society. The Nile was a centralizing force. Its predictable floods meant one pharaoh could control food, labor, everything from one capital. The river was a spine of absolute power. The Viking networks were the opposite. They were a web of competing ambitions. No king back in Sweden could command a ship on the Dnieper rapids. That journey was made by a chieftain and his crew. They used their own wealth, faced their own risks. The system thrived on that energy. It was decentralized, entrepreneurial, a marketplace of routes where rival families might control different portages, always jockeying for position. That competition drove innovation, drove expansion. A state bureaucracy couldn't do that. The difference is where the initiative came from. On the Nile, projects were decreed from above. On the Viking rivers, ventures were launched by individuals. A successful trip needed personal leadership. It needed deep knowledge of the environment. It needed the skill to negotiate with many different cultures along the way. That created a unique kind of person, a diplomat, warrior, merchant, someone whose power came from personal connection and logistical skill, not just an inherited title. The network's strength was its multiplicity. If one route was blocked by conflict or ice, other crews would find another path. If one chieftain failed, 10 others were ready to try. So the Norse system wasn't an empire administering land. It was a consortium of opportunists. They found a geographical loophole. They saw the cracks between kingdoms, the unguarded waterways, and they built a continent-spanning business in those gaps. Their power was fluid. It flowed where resistance was weakest and profit was highest. Maybe that's why their impact is so hard to pin down. They didn't leave behind pyramids or giant statues of kings. They left behind hybrid towns, mixed languages, a rewired map of how things were connected. Their legacy wasn't a monument, it was a current, a way of moving through the world that ended up changing the world itself. No Viking ever made a map we'd recognize as a map, not on parchment with coastlines drawn and places named. Their way of mapping was different. It was held in memory, in stories, in the practical know-how of getting from one river mouth to the next set of rapids. This became the 20th element of what their networks left behind, a new mental geography for Europe. The knowledge gathered from thousands of trips didn't just bring back silver. It slowly filled in the blanks on the continent's idea of itself. For a long time, the learned world in Western Europe, centered in monasteries, saw the north and east as places of mystery. They were zones from old Roman texts or legends, places said to have monsters. The Viking river networks changed that, not by writing books, but through the constant, practical travel of merchants and explorers. A trader coming back from the Volga didn't write a treatise, but he would talk. He'd describe the huge inland sea, the Caspian, which classical writers had often mistaken for a gulf of the ocean. He'd list the peoples he met, the Bulgars, the Khazars, the Rus. He'd talk about the river's course, its tributaries, the portages to other waterways. That information was gold. It was practical intelligence for the next voyage, but it was also geographic data, and it began to circulate. It reached courts, it reached monasteries. You can see its quiet influence in the few world maps that survive from that time, like the Anglo-Saxon Cotton World Map, made around the year 1000. It's still a theological diagram, Jerusalem at the center, paradise at the top. But if you look at the northeast corner, the shape of the Baltic Sea is hinted at. The lands of Scandinavia are there, labeled. That's a real shift. A century before, those areas were usually blank or completely distorted. The mapmaker's source wasn't scripture. It was almost certainly reports from travelers, people who had sailed those waters. Later medieval world maps, the big ones in cathedrals, show more of this change. They started to include more realistic, though still stylized, pictures of Northern and Eastern Europe. The river systems that were the backbone of Viking trade begin to appear as defining features. The Don, the Dnieper, the Volga, these become the arteries that give shape to the unknown lands. They're drawn not as random lines, but as coherent pathways leading from the northern wilderness to the centers of Byzantium and Asia. That's a quiet revolution in understanding. Europe was no longer just a Mediterranean world with some vague, scary outskirts. It was a connected landmass. Its rivers linked the Arctic to the Black Sea. The frozen north and the steppes were part of one single, interactive system. The Vikings, through their grueling routes, had done a continent-wide survey. They were like sensors moving through the landscape and collecting data points, where a river bent, where a pass began, where a certain people lived. Their biggest contribution to mapping was the idea of connection itself. A monk looking at an older map saw separate regions. A monk who'd heard the stories from Norse traders would start to see lines. Lines of travel, lines of trade, lines of possible communication. The map stopped being just a static picture of creation. It began to be a diagram of relationships. A suggestion that the parts of the world spoke to each other through channels you could learn and navigate and use. So we have no Viking map, but their journeys are the invisible lines on every later map of medieval Europe. They taught the continent its own shape. They replaced monsters with markets and unknown lands with a web of known routes. The world in the European mind got larger, more detailed, and deeply interconnected because a generation of surveyors in longships went out to measure it. Not with parchment and pen, with the keels of their ships and the stories they brought back. A network's stability doesn't come just from movement. For every longship that sailed over the horizon, there had to be a homestead that stayed. A place that couldn't move, and the 21st element of this whole system was the quiet, constant work of women. The sagas sing about the male adventurers, but the web they were weaving was held together by the people who stayed behind. In the Scandinavian homelands, a woman's responsibility was immense. With her husband or her sons away for years on a river voyage, she became the chief executive of the family farm. She managed the fields and the livestock and the harvest. She oversaw making cloth and storing food. She handled local trade, local disputes. Her success or failure decided whether there was a home to return to. This wasn't passive waiting, it was active stewardship, skilled work. It created the essential economic base. The silver flowing back from the Volga was wealth, but the barley in the storehouse and the wool on the loom, that meant survival. This division of labor was the engine's quiet counterpart. The mobile mail trader could only be mobile because a stable, productive base was maintained in his absence. But women moved too. They traveled with families to new settlements along those river roads. In places like the Danelaw in England or the river towns of Rus, Norse women often married into local families. These unions were far more than personal matches. They were diplomatic bridges, economic bridges. A Norse woman marrying a local chieftain or a Slav trader created a bond of kinship. It built trust between communities that had been separate. She became a living link, a translator of customs, a teacher of language to her children, who would grow up fluent in both Norse and the local tongue. And these bilingual children were the network's future. They could negotiate with their father's kin from the north and their mother's kin from the riverbanks. They inherited a dual perspective. That was a pure commercial advantage, a social advantage. Archaeology gives us glimpses. In a grave in northern England, you might find a woman buried with a pair of oval brooches. The style is unmistakably Norse, worn to fasten the straps of her apron dress, but around her neck might be a locally made pendant. Her grave goods tell a story of blended identity. She carried her homeland with her in her dress while putting down roots in a new land. These finds are silent testimony. They show women weren't just passengers. They were carriers of culture. They brought their weaving techniques, their culinary practices, their stories and rituals into new communities. They adapted them, blended them, and passed on a fused tradition to the next generation. Their role was about sustenance, not just of the body, but of the social fabric. They maintained the rituals that held a community together, the seasonal feasts, the remembrance of ancestors even when many of the men were absent. They provided the continuity. In a world defined by long absences and dangerous journeys, the homestead was the fixed point, the safe harbor. The place where the wealth brought home was invested in land, in buildings, in the future. It reminds us that history's most dramatic connections, the long voyages, the great trades, they rest on a foundation of less visible work. The Viking River network was a structure of both motion and stillness. The travelers mapped the routes, but it was those who maintained the homes and raised the next generation of connectors who ensured the network endured. True connectivity relies as much on the keeper of the hearth as on the sailor reading the stars. It's a partnership, one that writes its legacy not only in sagas of adventure, but in the enduring patterns of daily life. Woven patiently into the fabric of new worlds, a river's name is its oldest story. The big rivers, the Dnieper, the Volga, they kept their old Slavic names. But if you look at the smaller streams, certain bends, particular lakes, sometimes the names there hold a whisper. In parts of Russia and Ukraine, linguists find water names, hydronyms, that might come from Old Norse. A fast tributary might have been called something like the Rushing One by Norse boatmen. That name stuck, was adapted by local guides, and over centuries became the creek's official name. It's a subtle fossil, not a mark of conquest, just a practical label that outlasted the people who made it. The geography absorbed a nickname from a passing culture and made it permanent. This naming was a side effect of deep familiarity. To navigate these river systems year after year, Norse traders had to know every feature. That dangerous sandbar, that deep pool for anchorage, that rock marking a turn, they all needed names. In a trading post or around a campfire during a portage, these practical labels were shared with local Slavic and Baltic partners who worked the rivers with them. Over time, the most useful names entered the common language of the river people. They became operational knowledge, transcending where they came from. But the impact went deeper than names. It seeped into the stories. For generations, Slavic communities along the Dnieper would see these strange, dragon-prowed ships each spring. They'd hear foreign tongues, see unfamiliar goods, witness the immense effort of Portage. That sustained, mysterious presence left a mark on the local imagination. Folklore along these rivers is rich with specific motifs. Tales of water spirits, the Rusalka, sometimes gained new dimensions, stories of them luring foreign merchants or guarding sunken Norse treasure. Legends emerged of ghostly longships seen on misty mornings, crews of silent, helmeted figures forever traveling. Tales of hidden silver hoards buried under distinctive trees or near certain rapids, an echo of the real wealth that moved on the water. This created a shared mythological space. A Norse traveler might hear a local tale about a dangerous spirit at a particular river bend, a story meant to explain unpredictable currents. He'd carry that story back north, maybe blend it with his own beliefs about trolls. Meanwhile, the local community, by weaving the foreign ships into their stories, was making sense of this recurring phenomenon. They were integrating these outsiders into their understanding of the world. The river was no longer just a source of fish and a means of local travel. It was an artery of the wider world, carrying goods and narratives and fears and wonders. This intangible heritage is a profound reshaping. It shows connection changes more than economies. It changes how people see their own home. The physical geography, that bend in the river, that dark forest at the Portage Point, became layered with meaning. It held memory, the memory of commerce, of danger, of encounter. A child growing up by that riverbank centuries later would learn a story about a hidden treasure or a ghost ship. They might not know its origin, but they were inheriting a fragment of that age of connection. The landscape became a living archive, its lore the final, whispering testament to the centuries when those waterways pulsed with the traffic of a continent learning to link its distant shores. The most important thing the rivers carried wasn't something you could see, it was news. That was the 23rd point of this whole system. It moved information. These rivers were like a medieval internet. The data was in people's heads. A political shake-up in Constantinople, a new Byzantine emperor. That news didn't wait for a diplomat. It moved as fast as a trading ship heading back north. A merchant in Miklagard, that's what the Norse called the city, he'd hear the talk. He'd finish up, load his ship, and start the trip back up the Dnieper. And at every stop, every portage camp, every town, he'd tell the story. By the time his own ship got to the Baltic, the news was already ahead of him. Passed from one pilot to the next, so a chieftain in Hedeby could learn about a change in power in the empire months before any official word ever reached him. That knowledge was power. It meant he could change his trade plans, send different goods, get ready for a shift in who was in charge. The network made geography into a kind of news service. Slow to us, but for the time, it was unbelievably fast. And this flow, it wasn't just politics, it carried practical things, world-changing knowledge. A new way to harden steel, discovered in a Frankish workshop, could travel up the Rhine. It might reach a Norse smith in a town like Birka. He'd take the technique, mix it with his own ways, make a stronger sword. That better weapon might then go east with a mercenary, bringing the innovation to the Rus. Technical information was a silent passenger on every ship. Agricultural knowledge moved the same way. A Slavic method for storing grain through a bad winter, or a Byzantine trick for grafting fruit trees, these were priceless. They could decide whether a settlement made it or not. A Norse settler in England might learn a new plough design from an Anglo-Saxon neighbor, a design that started in the Rhineland. And that knowledge could filter back to Scandinavia with a relative coming home. The network was a living library. Its books were written in the things people did every day. Constantly updated, constantly borrowed, the transfer of military ideas was especially powerful. The Norse saw new kinds of fortifications in their travels, the stone castles in Francia, the complex earthworks, the Slavic gorodiches. They studied them, they adapted the ideas. You see it in the later ring forts built in Denmark like Trelleborg. That precise circular shape, that standardized design, it points to a centralized, learned way of building defense. Probably inspired by seeing more advanced engineering to the south and east. The stirrup, a technology that changed cavalry warfare, it spread across Europe along these same routes. Ideas about ship design, about siege tactics, about armor, all of it was part of this constant, informal schooling on the trade routes. This system cut through the isolation of Northern Europe. Before, Scandinavia was a fringe, a place of legend to the Mediterranean world, but now it was plugged in. A young man in a Norwegian fjord wasn't cut off. From the stories of merchants coming back, he knew the price of sable in Volga. He'd heard descriptions of the Hagia Sophia's dome. He might know a few words of Greek or Arabic. His map of the world in his head was huge, detailed. That connectivity sped everything up. A fashion for a certain kind of jewelry could sweep from Kiev to Dublin in one generation. A new artistic style, mixing Celtic knots with Norse animal art, could become a trend across Europe. The network created a shared cultural language, a set of styles that distant communities all recognized because they were all listening to the same stream of information. The real legacy of this information web was a change in how people thought. It built a culture of watching and adapting. To do well on these routes, you had to listen closely. Learn fast. You learn to see new ideas not as foreign threats but as possible tools. That flexibility of mind, sharpened on the riverbanks, it set these societies up for the bigger changes coming later. The full turn to Christianity, the rise of kingdoms, the birth of medieval states. The rivers carried more than silver and silk. They carried the future, whispered from one traveler to the next, slowly piecing together a new idea of a world that was connected. The Norse who settled in the west, in Normandy or the Danelaw, they blended. Within a few generations, they were speaking Frankish or English. Their old gods faded into local stories. But in the east, along the Dnieper and the Volga, it was different. The blend didn't erase them, it created something. The Viking ruling class, the Varangian princes and their warriors, they didn't just become Slavic. They became something new, they became the Rus. This was a slow absorption, inevitable really. The river network that gave them power meant they couldn't stay separate. To control the trade, they had to live among the people on the riverbanks. They built their fortified towns, their gorodiches, right at Slavic settlements. They married into the local elite families. These marriages were strategic. They tied the Norse newcomers to the land through kinship. A child from that kind of marriage grew up hearing two languages. They'd learn the Norse sagas from their father's companions and the local folklore from their mother's kin. Their identity was a fusion from the start. Language was the first change, the deepest one, to administer tribute, to settle disputes, to command respect. A prince had to speak to his people. Old Norse, the language of the longships, it started to recede from daily use. It became the private tongue of a shrinking warrior elite. The language of the court, of law and commerce, became a form of Old East Slavic, even the names adapted. Helgi became Oleg, Helga became Olga, Ingvar became Igor. These weren't just translations, they were a signal, a public declaration that this ruler belonged here, to this river and these people. Dress followed. The practical wool and leather from the north gave way to flowing robes, fine linens, the style favored in Byzantium, adopted by the Slavic elite. A prince in Kiev meeting Byzantine ambassadors, he wouldn't look like a sea king from the fjords. He'd look like a ruler of the south, his appearance placing him in a wider, civilized world. The most profound shift was spiritual. The Old Norse gods were gods of the sea, of the storm, of individual fate. They were portable, but the god of the Slavs, and more importantly, the god of the Greeks in Constantinople, was different. Orthodox Christianity offered a theology of empire, divine right, complex ceremony. It was the religion of the greatest city they traded with. Adopting it was another strategic decision. When Prince Vladimir of Kiev converted, late in the 10th century, he wasn't just choosing a faith, he was choosing an alliance, integrating his realm into the spiritual and political order of Christendom. The baptism of Rus was the final, formal step, but it came after a century of cultural osmosis. The river roads had carried icons north and priests and stories of this new faith for generations. The ground was already prepared, so within maybe 150 years the transformation was complete. The descendants of Viking adventurers were now Slavic-speaking, Orthodox Christian princes. They fought wars to defend their river-based state from steppe nomads, not just for plunder. They built churches in the Byzantine style, not Longship burial mounds. They wrote their law codes in Slavic. The river network succeeded so completely it made its original Norse architects obsolete. They were no longer the connectors from the outside. They had become the core of the thing they connected. It shows you something about deep connectivity. When you build a bridge, you have to stand on both sides. To maintain the flow, you eventually have to live in the middle. The Viking identity, so fierce and distinct on the open sea, it couldn't survive intact in the constant, intimate exchange of the river towns. It was diluted, enriched, and ultimately transformed by the very currents it mastered. The network's greatest triumph wasn't the silver it sent north. It was the new civilization it forged in the east, a civilization that remembered its northern origins only as a founding myth, a story of how the first princes came from beyond the sea. The connectors vanished into the connection, leaving behind a world forever changed by their journey. For a long time, the story came from the people who were afraid of them. The monks in England, in Ireland, in Francia, they wrote down what happened. The ships that looked like dragons, the fires, the theft. Those records were strong, they were vivid. They shaped what everyone thought about Vikings for 1,000 years. They were the great destroyers in the popular mind, the barbarians from the north. That was the story and it held, but that story wasn't the whole picture. It was only the view from inside the monastery. It missed what was happening outside that wall and far beyond it. Finding the Vikings again as connectors, as builders, that's a kind of detective work. It's putting together a different truth from evidence that isn't loud. It doesn't come from the big chronicles, it comes from what's in the ground. The real change started with a shovel, not a book, with archaeology becoming a science. When they started digging places up in a careful way, Birka in Sweden, Hedeby in Germany, the settlements along the rivers in Russia, they found something that made them stop. They didn't just find swords and charcoal, they found scales, little weights for measuring silver, exact ones. They found places where people made glass beads and jewelry. They found old docks, storehouses, and they found coins, so many coins. That was the proof of a society that traded, not just one that raided. The coins were the important part. The study of money, numismatics, it opened a door. A single silver coin found in a field in Sweden, you could follow it. The writing on it could say it was made in Baghdad under a certain caliph. By marking where these Islamic coins were found, all across Scandinavia and the East, scholars could draw the paths the silver took. They could see the routes, the towns it moved through. That evidence, that hard evidence, showed how big the trade was, how organized. It showed a long economic link between the Norse world and the empires in the East that the monks never wrote about. At the same time, historians started reading things they'd overlooked. The careful accounts from the Islamic world, from men like Ibn Fadlan who met the Rus on the Volga. The exact treaties from Byzantine emperors with the princes of Kiev. Those texts weren't about mindless barbarians. They were about trading partners, hired soldiers, diplomats. They described a complicated people taking part in the rituals and the politics of the settled world. So you had this evidence coming together, from the dirt, from the coins, from foreign records, and it meant the story had to be rewritten. The old split, civilized here and barbarian there, it started to fall apart. It got replaced by something messier and more true. The Vikings were both. They could be raiders on the Seine one year and then traders in Constantinople the next, arguing over a tax. The same kind of ship that carried warriors could carry silk. The same leader who led an attack might send his son to serve in the Byzantine emperor's guard later on. That's the real point, that ambiguity. It makes you drop the simple labels. To see history not as a fight between good and evil or order and chaos, but as this constant, messy process of people interacting. People who moved around like the Vikings. They weren't just wrecking a settled order. Often they were the ones connecting separate orders. They were the grease in the gears for good and for bad. They took chances that kingdoms wouldn't. They crossed lines other people saw as walls. And by doing that, they made new ways to communicate, new mixes of culture, new places of power. Changing this story, it does more than change how we see the past. It changes how we see now, today's world, with things and people and ideas moving fast everywhere. It also makes winners and losers. It blends cultures, makes new identities. It's driven by a mix of wanting to build something new, new technology, and sometimes taking advantage. The Viking Age shows us that this global linking isn't new. It's a pattern that happens again and again, and to understand it, you have to look past the loudest voices, the simplest tales. You have to listen to the quiet sounds from the riverbank. You have to read the maps that were drawn in silver. A modern freight train moving through a river valley in Ukraine. Its route isn't an accident. If you look at a map of Eastern Europe's transport lines, you see a pattern. The major railways, the modern highways, they don't cut straight. They snake. They follow the gentle curves of river valleys, the Dnieper, the Volga, the Western Dvina. These are the same pathways, the same corridors of least resistance that Viking longships used over 1,000 years ago. That shallow draft, choosing a route based on flowing water, has dictated the path of the iron horse and the asphalt road. The geography hasn't changed. The logic of movement just upgraded its technology. That journey from the Baltic Sea down to the Black Sea, the lifeblood of the Kievan Rus, is now a formal trade corridor. A channel for container ships, pipelines, data cables. The Vikings didn't build this modern infrastructure, but they identified its blueprint. They proved which lines on the map were the most efficient, the most sustainable for moving heavy things across a continent. Their success fossilized that knowledge into the land itself. This explains the enduring power of certain cities. Kiev, built on the high bluffs of the Dnieper. Novgorod, where the Volga River flows from Lake Ilmen. York, at the confluence of the Ouse and the Foss. These weren't just random settlements that grew large. They were deliberate nodes, chosen and amplified because they sat at the most critical junctures of the Viking web. A place like Novgorod controlled the portage between river systems heading north to the Baltic and south to the Volga. That made it wealthy. That wealth attracted people, built institutions, created a lasting political identity. When the trade in furs and silver eventually changed form, the city didn't vanish. It had already become a capital of culture, of governance, of craftsmanship. Its reason for being evolved from simply handling goods to administering the region that produced them. The same is true for Kiev, which grew from a fortified trading post into the mother of Russian cities. The initial spark was geographic advantage, a defendable spot on a north-south river highway. That spark ignited a political and cultural fire that burned for centuries. The city's modern importance, even now, is rooted in that original, river-born logic. It reveals a quiet truth about how human geography works. The most lasting changes to our landscape aren't always the most dramatic conquests or the grandest monuments. Often, they are the subtle, repeated choices of movement. A path walked by traders for generations becomes a dirt road. The dirt road becomes a gravel track, then a paved highway, then a rail line. Each iteration reinforces the original choice, embedding it deeper into the economic and social fabric. The Vikings, in their relentless pursuit of the best route from point A to point B, were performing a continent-wide survey. They were testing gradients, soil stability, seasonal accessibility. Their chosen paths became the paths of least effort for everyone who came after. Merchants with wagons, armies on the march, postal services, and finally, engineers laying steel rails, all followed the groove that had been worn into the map by centuries of river traffic. So when you see a major European city thriving today, or a key transport artery humming with activity, ask a simple question: is there a river nearby? The answer will often be yes, and the story of that place likely doesn't begin with a king's decree or a famous battle. It begins with something more fundamental. A group of people in wooden boats reading the water, looking for the current that would carry them, and ultimately the shape of a continent, into a connected future. Their legacy is written in the lay of the land, a permanent whisper in the routes we still travel. The Vikings didn't just travel across a map, they redrew it. Their ships with those shallow keels, they could slide over sandbars. They could turn a forest into a highway by dragging their boats. They were stitching a continent together. The rivers were the thread. It started with raids, but it became a system, a living network. That network carried things. Silver from Baghdad ended up funding kingdoms up north. Silk from Byzantium clothed a new elite in Kiev. And the settlers, the ones who planted farms along rivers in England, they blended their language in. We still use their words, sky, law. In the East, Norse chieftains became Slavic princes. Their forts grew into cities. The network was like a blender. It took separate cultures, poured them into these river channels, and what came out was something fused, something new. So the legacy isn't a list of battles. It's in the landscape. It's a modern highway following an ancient river valley. It's a town name ending in by or thorp. It's the political shape of nations that came from those trade routes. The Vikings showed that the most powerful force isn't isolation, it's connection, even when that connection is difficult or dangerous or carries a heavy cost. And that story, it holds up a mirror. We live inside another great network now, built of light and data instead of wood and water. Our digital rivers, the cables and the satellites, they're doing something similar. Moving ideas at light speed, creating new global cultures, challenging old borders, reshaping power. We're still learning how. The medium changed, but the human story didn't. We are still connectors, we build pathways, and we are transformed by the currents we choose to navigate.